Hey guys, in this video we're talking about the crowding out effect. Now what is the crowding out effect? That's when governments crowd businesses out of the financial market. Now what we mean by that, guys, is governments often run deficits, and when they run deficits, they have to go to the financial market and finance those deficits. They have to get money for those deficits. Now, we're not going to actually use the term money, we're going to use the term loanable funds. So for the rest of the video, when I say loanable funds, if it makes it easier for you, just kind of think money, okay? Generically, we can kind of just use the term money, but I want to be kind of technical in my language, so I'm going to say loanable funds. So again, governments, they run deficits often. So they need to go to the financial markets and get loanable funds. Remember, that's money, right? They're going to go demand loanable funds, which is going to drive up the price of loanable funds, which is the interest rate. And when they drive that price of loanable funds up, i.e. the interest rate, businesses are going to do less investment projects, right? They're going to spend less money on their business, okay? Because when that interest rate goes up, that's the price of loanable funds, financial capital, money, whichever word you want to use, going up. And that makes it more expensive to do those projects. So they're going to end up doing less projects, okay? Now, we're going to understand that graphically here in just a second, okay? So here again, one more time though, before we get to the graphs, the crowding out effect. When government deficits cause governments to borrow more, driving up interest rates, making it so businesses do less investment projects, because when that interest rate goes up, it becomes more costly to do those projects. Now, I'm going to do an interesting thing. I've got 3 graphs. It's going to be a pretty involved video as far as the graphs go. I think you're going to get a lot out of it because I'm going to do a few things, even like horizontal summations, which is going to help you out maybe in other types of economic problems that you might have. Okay, so here's the deal. I'm going to parse out, okay, the demand for loanable funds between the government's demand for loanable funds and businesses' demand for loanable funds, okay? First, take a look at the government's demand for loanable funds. It's very interesting, right? You immediately see that vertical line, okay? Very rarely do we ever see a demand curve that is vertical, okay? Now, when you see that vertical line, there's a technical name for that, which is called perfectly inelastic, which means they're not responsive at all to the price of loanable funds, which is the interest rate. Why are they not responsive to it? Because they have to borrow if they have a deficit. They're obligated to borrow if they have a deficit. Again, if you don't know what a deficit is, that's when the tax revenues going into the government is less than their obligations, okay? What I mean by their obligations is they have to do government transfers, which are called transfer payments, okay? Things like Social Security, unemployment compensation, things like that. And they have government purchases, okay? They have to buy goods and services and also pay all the government employees, all right? So they have all these obligations. If those tax revenues are less than their spending obligations, their expenditures, okay? If they fall short, the tax revenues fall short of all their spending obligations, they have a deficit and they have to finance that deficit. They have to get money for that deficit. They're actually legally obligated to finance that deficit, all right? So how much are they going to borrow is not dependent on the interest rate. It's just the size of the deficit, okay? Just to kind of emphasize that, take a look. That is the size of the deficit, okay? That's how much they're going to borrow at an interest rate right there. Guess what? That's the size of the deficit, the same size, right? That's how much they're going to borrow, even if the interest rate goes up. Again, they're not borrowing based on the interest rate. They're borrowing because they have a deficit, okay? Now, businesses, this is the business's demand for loanable funds, they are absolutely sensitive to the interest rate, okay? They're only going to borrow to do a project if the expected rate of return of that project is greater than the interest rate. So if the interest rate goes up, there will be less projects that have an expected rate of return greater than the interest rate, so they will do less projects, right? Interest rates goes up, they're going to do less projects. Interest rates go down, more projects will now have an expected rate of return greater than the interest rate. They will do more projects. So again, interest rate goes down, they will do more projects. Okay, they're sensitive to the interest rate. They're not sensitive to the interest rate. The next thing I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to add these two together. Here comes that horizontal summation piece, okay? I'm going to add the business's demand for loanable funds to the government's demand for loanable funds. So I'm going to start at my base, this little dashed line right here. See that dashed line? That is equal to that deficit. That's going to be my base because, hey, again, the government's going to borrow no matter what if they have a deficit. They're not sensitive to that interest rate. So there's the government borrowing. So that's going to happen no matter what. Now I'm going to add onto that deficit, okay, the business's demand for loanable funds. You can see I have a vertical intercept here, which means, hey, if interest rates go above 14%, just staying conceptual here, if interest rates go up above 14%, at least in my model, businesses aren't going to do any investment spending, right? A vertical intercept. Here, I'm not going to have a vertical intercept, right? I'm going to have that deficit first, and then I'm going to start the business's demand for loanable funds curve, okay? So this right here is part of the total demand for loanable funds. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to also say, hey, this part of that deficit right there that I marked off with that dashed line, that's also part of the total demand for loanable funds. Because, again, if that interest rate gets above 14%, hey, government's still going to borrow, but as we said before, businesses aren't going to borrow at all, right? But hey, above 14%, governments are going to borrow no matter what. So there it is. This is my total demand for loanable funds. Now I'm going to bring in a supply of loanable funds, okay? So let's just say the supply of loanable funds is right there. That's my supply of loanable funds. That supply of loanable funds is coming from household savings and from the rest of the world, okay? So there's my supply of loanable funds. My intersection point between supply and demand is right there. I'm going to draw this over, and I'm going to call that 8%, okay? 8%. Now I'm going to go over to this one, and I'm going to show 8% it'd be about right there, I think. Okay, there's 8% there. I'm going to draw that over. So let's just make sure that we're tracking right now, right? If the interest rate is 8%, what we're saying is the government's going to borrow that amount, because of course they are. That's the size of their deficit. And then businesses are going to borrow this amount right there, from this finger right to that finger. That's how much they're going to borrow, right? Now, this distance from there to there, that business borrowing right there, is equal to that distance right there, right? That is the same as that, okay? Now, we need to get to the actual crowding out effect. So let's now say that the government starts to run bigger deficits, does more stimulative policies, lowers the taxes or increase transfer payments or increase government purchases, which causes the deficit to get bigger. Now, if the deficit gets bigger, of course, that means this line shifts to the right? That deficit just got bigger. It just got bigger. They have to borrow more at every single interest rate. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dashed line in, straight down my graph, showing that the deficit just got bigger. The deficit was this big, now the deficit is that big, right? So I now need to add this curve to this curve, right? I had added it to that one, but now I got to add it to that one. So I go back to that 14%, put that dot right there, and I draw it down. Demand for loanable funds total. So that curve has shifted to the right. Now here's where it gets perhaps a little bit confusing, but if you stay with me, I think you'll be able to follow this, okay? So remember, this distance to that old equilibrium point was how much businesses were going to borrow at 8% right there. Well, here's how much they want to borrow. That distance right there is the same as that distance now, okay? So I know that was a little bit confusing. Let me say that again. That was how much businesses were going to borrow at 8%. Remember, that amount right there equaled that amount. Now, all that happened is because that deficit got bigger, it moved like this, right? So now from here, I'm going to go ahead and mark that with a dot. From here to here is how much businesses want to borrow at 8%. But they're not going to be able to borrow that, right? Because the interest rate's not going to be 8% anymore. Because, hey, take a look at this. At 8% now, this distance, look at that supply curve right there. That's the quantity supplied of loanable funds now. The quantity demanded of loanable funds is greater at that original interest rate. So what's going to happen? We have a shortage of loanable funds. And if we have a shortage of anything, the price of that thing goes up. The price of loanable funds is the interest rate. That interest rate's going to go up. Now, the good news is when that interest rate goes up, we're going to get a little bit more supply of loanable funds, right? We're going to get households to save a little bit more, and maybe the rest of the world's going to also bring a little bit more financial capital, money, loanable funds into our financial markets, right? That's what this is showing. Because remember, the suppliers of loanable funds, household savings, and the rest of the world. So you see, they're bringing more in because the interest rate's going up. Hey, I get more when I supply loanable funds. I get a higher interest rate. That incents me to bring more money in. So that brings us to here. Now, notice though, as that interest rate went up, businesses are borrowing less. Not, governments aren't going to borrow less, they're still going to borrow the same amount. So this reduction right here, this decrease, this moving to the left, decrease in the quantity demanded, that right there, from that little movement on the curve, that is the crowding out effect. That is getting them to borrow less. Remember what I said before, right? Hey, businesses were borrowing this much at 8%. Then we had that bigger deficit. So instead of this being it, this is, again, they still want to borrow that amount. This distance was the same as this, right? That is how much they were borrowing. They still want to borrow that much at 8%, but they can't. We got that shortage of loanable funds. The interest rate went up and it got businesses to borrow less. We can see this right here, over here, right? Just simply by putting a higher interest rate about right there, you see what will happen, right, with businesses. If the interest rate was right there, you get that movement along the curve. That right there is the crowding out effect. That is equivalent to that. That is businesses borrowing less because they're being quite literally crowded out of the financial market by the government's deficits getting bigger, by the government's need for loanable funds getting larger, right? By them needing to finance that deficit. That is the crowding out effect, right? When those deficits of the governments get bigger, pushing interest rates up, right? We had that interest rate go up, and when that interest rate goes up, businesses absolutely are going to borrow less because, hey, when that interest rate goes up, less of their projects are going to be profitable. They're going to have less projects that have an expected rate of return that is greater than the interest rate, so they're going to borrow less. I know, pretty involved. Horizontal summation and all in this video, but hopefully you followed it. I bet you if you watch it twice, you'll definitely get it, guys. That is the crowding out effect. That is governments crowding businesses out of the financial market because the government's deficits are getting bigger, their borrowing needs are getting greater. Hope that made sense to you. We'll see you in the next video.